How would you describe the taste of salt? Hi, I'm Laura Hansen Breksa, and I love to talk to people who put time, talent, energy behind what they believe. Welcome to Intent on Purpose. Today's guest, Dr. Julie Thompson-Dobkin, doesn't talk about spices, but we do talk about describing and communicating things that are personal experiences that are very difficult to describe in words. She runs the nonprofit Hidden Truths Project, demystifying epilepsy through art, and why she believes it can be done. Thank you, Julie Thompson-Dobkin, for being here with us on Intent on Purpose.
Thanks for having me, Laura. I really appreciate the time to talk to you.
How did you know you wanted to do science in your life?
You know, I grew up in a family. My father's a physician, my brother's a physician, and I've always been intrigued about understanding the world, about understanding myself. And I found that knowledge empowers individuals. The more you learn about yourself, whether it be science, medicine, even just understanding emotions, it's just more, it helps you accept yourself and move forward. And I love, trying to figure out the unseen, like how do molecules move? What is kinetic energy? What is, the only thing I didn't like was organic chemistry, but I was fascinated by animals, and we did a lot of dissections. And then I stayed on at the university as a teaching assistant in comparative anatomy. But in the back of my mind, I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do. And I knew zoology probably, unless I was going to teach, didn't give me a ton of options, but I was fascinated by animal behavior, all sorts of animals, physiology, biology. But I'm not even sure what the turning point was, other than I kept challenging myself to the next level. And it kind of was one of those things where, I came from a background of doctors. So I decided to pursue medicine, not really knowing, not 100% convinced that's what I wanted to do. And then I actually kind of took an alternative slant to that. I applied to schools that were MD programs as well as DO programs, and ended up selecting a DO school in Chicago. And part of it was philosophical. And I don't know if your audience knows much about Doctor of Osteopathic Medicine, but when they hear that term, they kind of go, she's not a real doctor. But in reality, yes, we are real doctors. We take the same boards, we get, residencies, internships, you name it. But the additional advantage of doing osteopathic medicine is you look at the human body as holistic. You look at the integration, not just of physical, one organ at a time, but how everything's interconnected. And that can be the physical and the mental. And so it's a very comprehensive approach. So we took all the sciences, but in addition, we had to take osteopathic medicine. And it created a much more open space for dialogue. And it was a challenge because people didn't know about it. And so my husband now and I were doing research together at the university in blood flow of the brain. So my specialty is cerebral vascular disease. I found neurology kind of like the work I do now, and I refer to it as a puzzle. I feel like the human brain is a puzzle. And as a neurologist, the most important thing for me was listening to the patient, picking up these fine details of someone's history and putting those pieces together to create a full story. Like I tell when I would mentor and have students, I would say, we put the pieces together. You have to be a good listener. And many times I'll have a working diagnosis in my mind before I'll do any blood work or brain imaging studies, things like that. So I already know what I think it is. I can localize in the brain where I think the problem is and have that working diagnosis. So I can target my approach to what tests I need to do. So even that concept of puzzle, I think that's the beauty of neurology because I'm a central nervous system neurologist. So I put those little pieces together to create a whole picture. When I was well into my being a neurologist, and when my son was 9, he developed epilepsy. Unfortunately, he was missed in the school district. He was in 3rd grade at the time. And they said, kids in 3rd grade, they're learning to be independent. They stress out a lot in the classroom. So they just posture, look out the window, daydream. And his grades were deteriorating, and I keep getting called to the school to pick him up in the nurse's office. One day I picked him up and he was really pale and had a severe headache. Bring him home, sleeps for a couple hours, he's fine. And then one night at the dinner table, he gets up from the table and he wanders around the kitchen. And all of a sudden I took off my mom hat, became a neurologist. So I went up to him and I said, "Hey, what's going on? We're eating dinner. You need to sit down." I looked at him and his eyes were twitching. He had a little bit of movement in his shoulders. So I automatically gave him some commands to see if he could follow the commands I was instructing him to do. And he couldn't. And when I saw his eyes, nystagmus in his eyes, I'm like, he's having a seizure. So unfortunately, I diagnosed my son's seizures. We took him to the emergency room. And of course, then my mom had flips on. And, every step of the way, I was so anxious. I was so sad because I felt like it was so out of control. And then having navigated 7 years of multiple drugs and endless testing and learning how to be a mom and what was important as a mom to report to a neurologist. So I kept journals, drugs, side effects, this worked, this didn't work. Here's his blood test, here's his EEG, here's his MRI. And what was hard for me, but I had to hold my ground, was giving him a leash that wasn't too long to protect him, but not be overbearing. And sometimes parents are their own worst enemies. And I share this a lot with parents, more for them as caregivers, that they have to run a really fine line. It's a fine line because sometimes the parents create the stigma associated with epilepsy. And so as a parent, we become stigma coaches, basically. So my husband and I were very cautious about giving them freedoms, but teaching him responsibility at a very, very young age, almost to a fault. But he grew up and he's incredibly successful. So anyhow, during this period, after 7 years gaining seizure freedom, I was like, okay, I need to get back to epilepsy. How can I do that? Well, throughout this whole time, I'm studying art and I'm studying neurobiology, creativity, and I come across the work of Dr. Stephen Schachter out of Harvard. He's going to be speaking in San Francisco, so I fly up there to hear him at the Pipeline Conference, and I'm like, this is what I'm going to do. He studies the art of epilepsy. He produced a book, Vision Artists Living with Epilepsy. So I went and introduced myself, and he pretty much took me under his wings and let me run with it, this concept. So he's been a really strong presence and mentor in my life, Dr. Schachter, and he's been just amazing, attended many of our events and been our honoree several occasions. He, originally when I started this work, I was just looking at the art of epilepsy. And at first I'm like, okay, if the seizure's coming out of this part of the brain, this must be what the artwork is like. I learned very quickly, and Steve also kind of guided me, not everything that an epilepsy patient does in terms of art is exactly because of that seizure. However, having said that, now 14 years into this work, I have probably 1,000 artists I work with all over the world, all continents of the world. And I classify their art in 4 categories, really. Some are truly seizure-based, like we were discussing earlier. If they can be as they get the aura before the seizure starts, during the seizure, or after the seizure. Some artists their mind allows them to create art during that period. So the art can be really abstract, trippy, and then there's the form of art that is associated with the psychosocial issues, the depression, the sadness, the loneliness, isolation, the loss of independence, the fear, the anxiety, the uncertainty. So many reflect that, the psychosocial issues within their art form. Then there's also the form that they've been through so many tests. They've had depth electrodes in the brain. They've had monitors. They've had, numerous EEGs. So what they do is they take that and they will create their art on the basis of testing. Then there's a group that are well controlled, and they want to give back to that community. They want to create this community that they can share their stories. So they submit their art. And then actually there's 5 categories. And then there's the caregivers and SIVs, because like you, I'm sure, are well aware of, epilepsy is a family disease, or condition, we should say. And it involves the family. I have an older son. The younger son has epilepsy. But, when they were in high school, it's inevitable. If you have a child with epilepsy, they're going to get more attention. So you have to be very careful about, the SIBs. And I remember probably about 8 years ago, we had the brother of a young girl who had epilepsy submit a piece of artwork, and the piece was absolutely brilliant. He took his hands and put them up like this, and within each hand, he did, like, I don't know if it was India ink, and it was the most elaborate, chaotic structures within the hand, and he called it chaos. And the reason he did that was because he was sitting in the back seat of the car when his sister had a seizure for the first time, and feeling helpless as an older brother, like, what can I do? And how it disrupted the family. And so I think including them in our art exhibits is an extremely important thing, because they are involved in that. It involves the family.
I absolutely agree and experience it is a family disease. I have to tell you how I handled it. You will be shocked, Maid. And you might punish me or feel like hitting
No.
me with a noodle. No. I was diagnosed after my youngest baby was born. That's when I started having seizures, and one major seizure, and then went to the emergency room and had the test and had 6 seizures during the EEG and all the pleasantries that followed that. We didn't talk about it. We didn't research it. I couldn't drive for the first 6 months, obviously. So, but my children, if I'm just tired in a day, they go, Mom, did you take your drugs? Mom, did you take your medication? And we're out in public. And I didn't realize until years later that they were always worried.
Yeah.
They were always concerned about their mother. So see, you might want to reach out at the computer. Why didn't you have it together? But
Well, it's scary though.
Poorly handled.
Right. Yeah. And, it's scary if you don't know what to expect. And that's the whole concept for me in the work I do now. Is I think that ignorance leads to fear, or I shouldn't say ignorance, lack of knowledge leads to fear. And so if we can educate people in the reality of epilepsy, the scary parts, the good parts, the normalcy, side effects, if we can educate people, they won't be afraid. They won't run away if they see someone have a grand mal seizure on the street. Instead, they'll go and help them. And I think through this work, the more we can educate the public, we can get rid of that fear. We can create empathy, understanding, and hopefully create a better society. It's a huge ambition, but I honestly believe people fear what they don't know. And so the whole concept of Hidden Truths Project is art is something that everybody can relate to. They might like it, they might hate it, they think it's distasteful, they think it's gross, it's ugly, it's beautiful, and that's okay. If you can elicit a feeling, an emotion, you've done your job, because it allowed an engagement with someone that knew nothing about it. And the interesting thing I discovered, and an artist taught me this when I work with closely in Florida. She does, in quotes, true seizure-based art. She creates art during her seizures, and she has multifocal epilepsy. So she has multiple foci in the brain that are triggering her seizures. Sometimes she's cognizant, sometimes she's not cognizant. And she has, whether it be the occipital lobe of the brain, the frontal lobe of the brain, temporal lobe of the brain. So her seizure types are very different. And she has this piece, and it shows 3 bodies outside of each other, but it's herself. And she said, it's essential when you are sharing this work, you have to give some context. Because originally I'm like, oh, the art speaks for itself, but it doesn't. People, they'd look at it and they go, oh, this must be some schizophrenic or something. And she said, it's extremely important that you put some context into that. Then that creates understanding. And it is so true. So now what I do with each of our exhibits, I create labels. And in the labels, I make every artist that submits artwork give me a statement and tell me about your art. Has epilepsy influenced your art? And then I create a book for each exhibit. In addition, on the long form labels, I will put in part of their statement to create a better understanding of what the art they're looking at and what it means in their lives. And so art can be an incredible tool to educate because people relate to art. Like I said, they could love it, they hate it, but if it allows that connection, it creates more knowledge and understanding. So indirectly, I refer to art as a tacit form of knowledge, and art is it's a form of knowing. It's very empiric in that individual. It's the inside outside story. And so I consider the artists that I work with storytellers. They're telling me their story through their art form to create understanding and educate the public. And in the process, though, the beauty of it is it empowers them, because when they walk into a gallery and they see their art on a wall, it's like, whoa, someone thought that was worth hanging on a wall to allow the public to see it. So it's also a form to empower the individual while engaging the public to create understanding and education. So it's combining all those elements to complete a picture, a story.
I like the completing the picture and completing a story, because epilepsy doesn't end. You don't become cured of epilepsy. You manage it, you live with it, you might control it. Usually it's more managing than control, but it doesn't heal.
Disappear. No.
Yeah. Even if you've had surgery, there's an implant. There's
Right.
scars from that. So to have something finished,
Yeah.
have a statement, is a very healing thing. So that's a beautiful
Absolutely.
opportunity for someone to be heard. Because there is an anxiety that people heal. And I know that your Hidden Truths Project isn't just for epilepsy, it's for other hidden diseases. And I want to bring this up at this time because there's something that people may not understand. Well, there's two things. First of all, when you have a hidden disability, hidden disease, you can become very much more aware that everyone around you could also have a hidden disability.
Right.
So you can become very empathetic to the person who's grouchy in your line behind you, because you could think, oh, they might have just gotten real bad news at the doctor and I just can't
Right.
see. Or they might be in chronic pain. So they're a little edgy today because it hurts worse than normal. So you become a little more sensitive because you yourself have something no one else can see. So I
Right.
take that as something I'm going to make a little good out of the situation. The second thing is you also live with this underlying dependency level. That's a little anxiety. And so when things become upheaval in the world, it raises your anxiety because you're dependent on medication. What
Right.
that means is you're dependent on truckers. We love truckers because they bring medicine to the pharmacies. You're dependent on the pharmacist to be intelligent. You're dependent on the pharmacy to have the medication. You're dependent on the insurance company to not change their insurance. You're dependent on the pharmaceutical companies to keep producing the pills that work for you. You're dependent on your doctor to get the prescription filled on time. It's crazy, all the human beings that you need to do their job and to have integrity to do the job, so you can get that little pill, so you can, some big little pills.
I so relate to what you're saying. And one of the things, even with our work, people say is, I can control my art. I can decide what colors, what brush strokes I want to use, what photograph I want to take. It's one part of their life that they have complete control over, because nothing else. It takes a long time to get control over the rest. And like you said, some people can't drive, and there's terrible public transportation where they live, or they have poor health insurance and they can't get what they need, or the doctors, and I've had this experience on numerous occasions, not just with my son, but with other patients I've dealt with, they don't respond to generics. They need a trade name. They need that newest drug that was just released and unfortunately cost a fortune. But I know what controls the problem. And, you fight insurance companies, you fight, with the pharmacy, because it's against FDA regulations, this dosage on drug, but that's what controls it. And so, it's frustrating. And the uncertainty, I think that's the scariest thing, not just for the individual, but for the parents. I see families, myself, I just met with a mom the other day, and it's not knowing. And when they're a teenager in high school and, they want to go to a party, and who knows, there's drugs, there's alcohol, they stay up late. I mean, everything that would trigger a seizure. And giving them freedom with responsibility, but you let them do it, and they're good kids. But it doesn't, it's easy to fall into peer pressure. And the anxiety, I could never sleep until he got home, And so, and like you said, epilepsy rarely, if ever, is cured. And so there's always that potential they could have a seizure. And then you start from ground zero, lose your license, find a new drug, up a drug, change a drug, and then you've got that kind of period where you're transitioning and you just don't know, and so it's always, you don't know. And that's a scary concept. Like, oh, I just can't do this and that, and then it's done, it's never done, but I don't want to be, yeah. I mean, that sounds really pessimistic, because I think what we can do, you and I and other people that are advocates for epilepsy, is show them, like you were saying, that there are many people in this world that live with hidden disabilities, some visible, some invisible, like epilepsy, that are struggling, mental health issues, depression, suicide, schizophrenia, maybe it's poverty and homelessness, living on the streets, and no one looks at them as a human being. Instead, they're this label. It's, you're just some scumbag on the street that you're doing drugs, or you just talk funny because you're stupid or something. And it's the drugs to control my seizures, to control whatever. And so everybody becomes a label when it doesn't fit into what is considered neurotypical, you know, conceptually, if you think about what is neurotypical, what is normalcy. I'm going to share one quote, or not quote, but showcased documentary on our website, and it was called Perfectly Imperfect. And we talked about neurodivergency, and this is an interesting fact that right now 15 to 20% of the world's population is considered neurodivergent. Of that, 1 in 5 people may identify as having some neurodivergency traits. And this could be, dyslexia. It could be ADHD. It could be epilepsy. It could be a multitude of things. And so when you think about that in this huge world, how many people are struggling with certain of these hidden traits? And so I think, whether you have epilepsy, whether you have ADHD, whether you have traumatic brain injury and you're a little bit slowed down, we have to learn to be a more accepting society. We have to learn that just because I think this way doesn't mean the way they think or the way they do things is wrong. And that's the beauty of the world in reality. I mean, I think conceptually, if you think about how wonderful it is in the world to have diversity. I mean, can you imagine if everybody wore the same clothes, dressed the same, listened to the same music, ate the same food? I mean, it would be so boring, I honor their contributions. And I think it's really important to keep an open mind and how people contribute in the world,
Absolutely. And to give them place to contribute.
Yeah, right.
Like the Truth Project does.
Yeah.
Yeah, to give them that space. And
yep. And consistently at the exhibits, and we always invite the artists, and sometimes we do artist talks so they can share more in depth about their creation and the impact of epilepsy on their lives. And the one thing that they consistently say throughout the years is, I finally could go into a space. My epilepsy wasn't a label. Everybody got me, or maybe they had a different experience, but they could relate to me. And so it was like all of a sudden I had a community that was understanding, accepting, and welcomed me in. And was just very empowering to them, that they could freely talk about their hangups related to epilepsy. They could freely talk about the weirdness sometimes that happens and feel welcomed and accepted. And that's hugely important.
For grown men who have epilepsy, who have to have limits on their safety, that's also impactful. You can't go do that, but they're a grown man.
Right.
Because it's too dangerous and they've got their children and a wife there. That's impactful. To have a young adult who's just beginning their life, who have to have parents monitor them and have to have caregivers, that's hugely impactful. And to have a place where they can maybe express that frustration in art, because I don't know how you'd put that in words besides screaming.
That is so true. In fact, 2 pieces of art we have in the show in San Francisco are from caregivers or parents, or, well, one's an aunt of someone, a professional artist. And the one, I absolutely love this piece. And it's it looks to me almost Aboriginal, but what it shows is this road that keeps winding. And on the road, there's an individual running, and they just can't escape. And it's her rendition of being a mother of I don't know if it's an adult son or a late teen. And she never has downtime. And she never can get on top of the epilepsy because he has frequent seizures. And she's constantly running. And it's the most beautiful piece of art. And then there's another piece done that takes a mom of an adult son with epilepsy. She did kind of a fractionation of imagery of their bodies and on the different frequencies of existence. It's kind of philosophical, but it's a beautiful piece of art. And it's showing the mom as a total caregiver for an adult man with epilepsy, uncontrolled seizures. And it just shows you that, art is incredibly powerful when you read those stories and you read what people go through. It's just, there's times I can honestly say, doing this for so long and working with artists all over the world, that at some point I just want to escape, because it's so sad sometimes what people have to deal with. I've seen the whole spectrum when people live with a disability, epilepsy on top of like autism or something else. And if they're nonverbal, then they have a hard time explaining if there's something else going on. But, of course you have this label, and so it must be this or it must be that. And I've seen misdiagnoses in patients because the person was nonverbal, and then something happens and it's too late to treat the patient. And it's just so unfortunate that people get treated this way. And I think the beauty also of the Hidden Truths Project I've found, because we had a group in Uganda we worked with, we had another group in Spain, and even India, Jamaica. And it doesn't matter what country they're from. All of them had epilepsy. Their stories are one and the same, other than some have a few more obstacles to overcome because of their religion, or because it's considered they're possessed by evil spirits. The interesting thing is, did you ever read When the Spirit Catches You, Anne Fadiman? And just the disconnect between understanding cultures and how do you approach cultures. So I'm also, in the work I did prior to just running the nonprofit, I ran a free clinic for neurologic patients that were uninsured. Many were Mexican. And I think that it was super important for me to understand the cultural aspects of what they were contending with. So if it was dementia, for example, or it was epilepsy, or it was some awful movement disorder, it was important that I look at their cultural background to know how to navigate to relate to them. And I would use translators a lot because a lot of them did not speak English. And so I speak broken medical Spanish, and then I had all my nursing staff spoke fluent Spanish. And so we would talk about the cultural aspects of it, the diseases, so that we could relate to the patient better. And I think it's really important in today's society when you look at how many different cultures that live in our world, in our immediate environment, and try to meet them where they're at, not try to make them, acculturate them to be our way.
Yeah, I think that's very important to meet them where they are. And it's incredibly hard to describe a seizure.
Right, right,
It doesn't come with words. It's not narrated. And then you're describing an aura before a seizure, and it's impossible. It's
right,
just,
right,
so a neurologist is hearing the words. So and if there's a translator in between, you feel like you're speaking about a science fiction movie when
right.
you're describing what happens. In fact, when I was describing a seizure once, I actually used a term from Star Trek, but I can't imagine having to have a translator even and trying to figure out what's happening with the patients. And you just have to do the best you can with the evidence presented to you.
Right, right,
And so I'm imagining art, if someone is trying to describe a seizure in an art piece, maybe that is one more layer, but that's not going to really even tell the story. So I think it's another frustrating layer. It's like describing pain or describing the flavor of salt.
yeah.
There's not, I don't know how to say, I
Word to
can't even
describe.
describe what I'm saying. I can't
Yeah,
just communicate the way there is no way to communicate.
right, right. And there's there's a great book. It's called The Dictionary of Obscure Sorrows. And in it, it's like when words don't exist to describe something. And what the gentleman did is he would take some Latin derivations and some contemporary words and combine them to create meaning as best as he could. But I've been in this long journey of writing a book, and the whole focus is called The Art of Knowing, the Inside Outside Story. But in there, when you look historically, language is limited. I mean, language was developed to describe the physical world. But when you take that form of tacit knowledge, that emotional knowledge, there aren't words that exist. So what do? You create sentences out of multiple words that have been developed to physically describe the physical environment. But then there's that whole other section of existence that there aren't words that exist. So what I do with our work is we call it tacit knowledge. We take that emotional component and the art form becomes that language. And I'm a really big advocate. At first, I'm like, okay, art and science merge. This is the way it's going to be. But no, they don't have to. So in the book, I talk about qualitative versus quantitative data, because every time I apply for a grant or something, it's like, what are your numbers? I can only capture stories from individuals, the words that they share. And even when you do some of these standard tests on emotions, well-being, most of them are going to be focused, especially if you talk about epilepsy, on drug side effects. And they don't talk about the psychosocial issues and the other stuff. And so what I found is that form of knowledge, artistic knowledge, any of the arts complements science. It shouldn't replace it. I mean, we need the scientific perspective, because it's developed the next drug, the next imaging technique. And it's advanced our knowledge of epilepsy, but it hasn't addressed that other aspect. And there's only limited studies. It's not like you work with a hypothesis, you do these experiments, you have an answer, and boom, then it becomes, the traditional form of knowledge. We can't do that with this epilepsy, especially, but art can. I mean, so it can complement the science. So art complements science. It doesn't supplant it or it doesn't replace it. It complements it and creates better understanding. And there's another really great book called Your Brain on Art, which is also discusses more of the kind of physiologic effects of art on the brain and things like that, and why it's so empowering, from a physiologic standpoint. But I think we have to look at art in a new way. And there was an interesting article actually on LinkedIn, and it was published in the Forbes magazine on creativity, art, the brain, and why it's important in our society today, because it gives that voice to people who have been marginalized, who have been silenced, and allows them to tell their stories. So whether it be graffiti art, a mural on a wall, it is giving a voice to someone that normally just doesn't get a voice. They don't get a say, So it allows them to storytell through their art form and hopefully, make some impact on society and our democracy. We can share this knowledge. So I think it's an incredibly powerful tool that people just have neglected.
And where can people see the artwork? What's the website?
Our website is www.hiddentruthsproject.com. And we're just changing out the gallery for the March events. And then we have 2 events in March. We have March 21st at Diane Disney Miller Exhibition Hall in the Presidio in San Francisco on the 21st with some dynamic speakers. Our honoree is out of UCSF Benioff Children's Hospital, Dr. Singha. And then I have 2 presenters that are doing incredible work on 3D modeling of the brain, doing virtual reality, and he's going to set up some virtual reality classes. And another gentleman that is looking at brain waves and frequencies in the brain, translating them into spectrograms. Then he works with a glassmaker out of Ireland and creates installations of stained glass windows of the frequencies. So that's in March, and there are tickets available. If you go to the website, you can register. And then March 28th, my partner's going to that one in Disneyland, Coronado Springs in Orlando. And then we have a Chicago event on October 12th through the 18th. And then Newport Beach, November 7th of the art. And then quickly in February next year, we'll be again with Epilepsy Foundation New England in Boston.
Thank you very much, Julie, for being with me today.
Thanks for having me, Laura. I really appreciate it. And I love hearing your story, and I can relate. So thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
Thank you. 5 takeaways from my conversation with Dr. Thompson-Dobkin. Growth begins with curiosity. Even the detours shape who we become. Number 2, art helps us understand what science alone can't always explain. When we share our stories, we replace stigma with connection. Number 4, real understanding comes not just from data, but from listening. And 5, living with a chronic condition isn't about control. It's about resilience, adaptation, and continuing the journey. If you want to find out more about epilepsy, go to epilepsy.com. That's EPILEPSY.com.